So here's a picture of a neuron with its basic parts showing how the action potential is sent. So here's the cell body of the neuron, the dendrites, the axon terminals, and the action potential, or the electrical signal, that electrical current will be sent from the cell body through the axon to the next cell that is connected to the neuron. And the connections between the neuron and other cells are called synapses. So a synapse is basically just a connection between a neuron and another cell. And here's an example of a synapse, or several synapses. This is actually the synapses between a neuron and other neurons. We have 3 other neurons connected to this neuron with their axon terminals. So you can see axon terminals, they're kind of like plugging into this neuron in a way, kind of like we're plugging in our devices into a charging cord. Like we can take our cell phone and plug in our charging cord. So this is kind of like the charging cord, and this is going to be our cell phone, and it's going to have a battery inside that is charging. So in a way. So here's how synapses can be formed. It can be formed between the axon terminals of one neuron and the dendrites of another neuron. It can be formed between the axon terminals of one neuron and the body of another neuron, or it can be formed between the synapse terminals or axon terminals of one neuron and the axon, beginning of the axon of the next neuron. So all of these neurons, red, blue, and green, of course, they're not this color in our body. They have a slight yellow tinge, but not that much color. It's just exaggerated for picture purposes. So this red neuron, this blue neuron, this green neuron will send, you can see the arrows, they will send stimulus to this neuron. And when this neuron is stimulated enough, it's going to produce its own electrical stimulus inside, and that electrical stimulus, the action potential, will be sent down the axon to the next cell. Maybe that's a neuron, maybe that's a muscle cell. So the name of the neurons that are connected in a synapse will be presynaptic neuron, is the neuron that will be sending stimulus to the next neuron, and the next neuron in line will be postsynaptic neuron. So this is a postsynaptic neuron, these are presynaptic neurons. The connections between the neurons are called neural circuits, and these are different ways that neurons can be connected. One neuron can be connected to 2 neurons. This neuron can be connected to 2 more neurons. This is called the diverging circuit. You can skip through the next slides to read about it more. Several neurons can be connected to one neuron, like we saw in the previous example in the previous slide. This is called a converging circuit. The connections can be quite complex. They can be connected in a sequence, and then there's going to be other neurons connected kind of like backwards to the previous one. They can be even more complicated like this, like one neuron connected to the next, but then there's going to be other branches feeding in that are interconnected. So our brain has thousands of these connections of these neural circuits. Okay, so the connections are, individual connections are called synapses. And inside of the synapses, this is what happens. There's going to be neurotransmitters released by the presynaptic neuron into the space, into the synapse, and received by the postsynaptic neuron. Here's another picture representing that. So presynaptic neuron releases the neurotransmitters, and postsynaptic neuron is receiving the neurotransmitters. The neurotransmitters can come in many different types based on what neurotransmitter it is. the postsynaptic neuron will respond differently. There are special receptors on the surface of the postsynaptic neuron, and these receptors can only receive a specific type of a neurotransmitter. So, for example, if a neurotransmitter was released by the presynaptic neuron, this neurotransmitter can be received by these receptors on a postsynaptic neuron only if these receptors are a good match for these neurotransmitters. If the receptors do not match the neurotransmitters, the postsynaptic neuron will not receive these neurotransmitters even though they are released into the synapse, and will not respond to this neurotransmitter. So the way our bodies are able to control the communications between the neurons or neurons and other body cells is by controlling these receptors that are present on the surface of the postsynaptic neuron. So by having specific receptors or not having the specific receptors, the postsynaptic neuron will be able to respond to the neurotransmitters that the presynaptic neuron is releasing. Here are some examples of the most common neurotransmitters in the body. We have adrenaline. It's the neurotransmitter that produces the fight or flight response. It is produced in stressful situations, increases the heart rate and blood flow, leading to a physical boost and heightening awareness. The opposite of that is a GABA neurotransmitter. It's a calming neurotransmitter. It calms the firing nerves in the central nervous system, and it improves the focus. If there's not enough of it, it causes anxiety, and it also contributes to motor control and vision. So you can see that the function of the neurotransmitters is quite variable. That is because depending on where these neurotransmitters are produced. So vision, maybe it's going to be in the visual pathway. Motor, it's in the motor pathway somewhere. The dopamine is a neurotransmitter for pleasure. When it's released in the brain, it produces the feeling of pleasure. It is the neurotransmitter that's associated with addiction, because addiction is the craving of the pleasure that we received from something. Addictions could be good or bad. Serotonin is a mood neurotransmitter. It contributes to the well-being and happiness when it's released in the brain. It also regulates the digestive system, so it could be released in the gut of the brain. It is affected by exercise and light exposure. Basically, its production increases with exercise and light exposure. The neurotransmitters called endorphins, there's lots of different types of endorphins. They produce the feeling of euphoria. These are the neurotransmitters released during exercise, excitement, and sex. They're known to reduce pain and produce the feeling of well-being. So sometimes these neurotransmitters are released when we're experiencing extreme pain to help our bodies to cope with that pain. So to summarize all of the synapses in the body, synapses are connections made between neurons and body cells. The synapses can be made between two neurons. This is indicating the body of the neuron. This is the axon and axon terminal. So the connections could be made between two neurons, the presynaptic and postsynaptic neuron, by the axon terminal connecting to the body or the dendrites. The synapses can also be made between the neuron and a muscle cell. So the presynaptic cell will be a neuron and postsynaptic cell will be muscle. This neuron will be stimulating the muscle cells to contract through its neurotransmitters. And the synapses can be made between neuron and a gland cell, for example, like a sweat gland or tear-producing gland. The presynaptic neuron will control the postsynaptic gland through its neurotransmitters to produce its secretions.